Robert, am I allowed to be excited about a CPU launch in 2024 anymore? After everything that's happened? After the AMD launch of the 9000 series, after Arrow Lake, am I allowed to be excited about a desktop CPU launch?
I don't think so.
No? Well, I'm actually excited about the 9800X3D. Yes, after the flops that was Arrow Lake and the Ryzen 9000 series, which has, by the way, improved a lot. You should check out our video right up here. The 9800X3D, I'm really hoping this is a sort of redemption story for the entire year of CPU launches. And boy, does this thing have some big shoes to fill. While personally, I think the 5800X3D is one of, if not the best CPU launches in the last decade, the 7800X3D ended up being another high watermark in my opinion. It provided huge speed ups versus the 5800X3D and allowed AMD to keep ahead of Intel in the gaming CPU race. And yes, it even destroys Intel's best Arrow Lake chip. But that it wasn't particularly hard to do in the first place, now was it? But you know what isn't a flop? Well, I'm going to tell you right now. It's the 9800X3D and this AIO from Montech.
Montech with another insane value product, the Hyperflow ARGB AIOs, available in black or white, 240 or 360 sizes, with full platform compatibility and friendly tools along the way that not only look gorgeous with pump lighting and matching blade illumination, but also performance that should satisfy with any hot silicon thanks to high-speed fans, high-density fins on the rad, a good pump, and daisy-chained fans for easy cable management, all backed by the 6-year warranty, so you don't have to worry. Check it out below.
Anyways, the 7800X3D is still so good, and everything else on the market is basically so disappointing right now, at least for anybody who wants to build a new system, that retailers have started marking up that chip like you wouldn't believe. Not only that, it is actually retailing for significantly more than it was actually launched for last year. A lot of that is due to the fact that supply is drying up, as I think AMD is shifting a lot of their 3D V-Cache production to the 9000 series now. But ironically, at $480, it aligns perfectly with the 7800X3D's currently inflated price. I mean, sure, it's $30 more than the previous X3D chips, but AMD has built this thing to be a lot more versatile. It's supposed to be the best gaming CPU out there while also not getting its teeth kicked in productivity apps. You see, this version, well, it should buck a few long-standing trends for X3D CPUs by moving its 3D V-Cache below the processing dies rather than on top of them. This technically allows for better temperatures and more even heat distribution, since there's a more direct pathway for transferring heat towards the IHS rather than having to go through the cache die first. With that one change, AMD was able to push average clock speeds further than they normally could for X3D chips. So the 9800X3D's base clock gets a 900 MHz uptick versus the 9700X, though the max boost still sees a small reduction. There's also a jump in both boost and base clocks against the 7800X3D, while the L3 cache, or 3D cache in this case, it stays the same. Another little interesting item that's rolled out alongside the 9800X3D is a so-called X3D Turbo Mode by Gigabyte. Turbo Game Mode on Asus boards and other manufacturers call it something else altogether. Basically, this is a simple toggle in the BIOS that disables SMT and one of the CCDs on dual CCD chips. It's available on all AM5 processors, not just X3D models, but it hasn't rolled out for AM4 boards yet. So unfortunately, any of its benefits are not going to be seen on the 5000 X3D series. Think of it like a one-stop shop for potential frame rate optimizations that's easily accessible, but because of its very nature, performance in multi-threaded workloads will basically get absolutely killed. It isn't anything new either, since all of these settings were already there, just hidden a bit deeper in the BIOS, whereas this is planted right on the home page as a single on and off switch. Anyways, I'm going to be tackling a lot of other things like temperatures, power consumption, and 2D performance later in this video, because I know what you're all here for. You want to see how the 9800X3D performs against all the other CPUs that we have lined up for you in gaming. So let's set the stage here. We're using the same setup as the Arrow Lake review, but for optimal performance, the 9800X3D required a new BIOS with an updated Giza 1.2.0.2 firmware. We're using that exclusively for the 9800X3 and 7800X3D, so you can't compare the 7800X3D numbers here to previous videos. Finally, while the 360mm AIO is used for all 2D testing, gaming was done with a Noctua NH-D15 G2. We'll also be testing the 9800X3D with and without the motherboard's so-called turbo mode to give you an idea of what it can and can't do, but unfortunately we didn't have time to test it on the 7800X3D or other AM5 CPUs, so I'm including the enabled numbers here as a simple reference point, and they won't be factored into any of my opinions about this processor. I should also explain these charts a bit. We've decided to test at 2 different resolutions and settings, 720p with a low preset to eliminate as much GPU bottlenecking as possible, and 1080p with maximum quality settings to show a more real-world scenario these processors will likely find themselves in. Anyways, starting with Alan Wake 2 performance, well, it tends to get GPU bound at 1080p, but at 720p, the 9800X3D can really show what it's got. It gets by far the best results here. Instead of being essentially tied with the 7800X3D like it was at 1080p, it's more than 10% ahead, and in a whole other world when compared to the other CPUs here. You might also be wondering why most of the CPUs get better 1% lows at 1080p here, and that's likely because the game engine just doesn't seem to like running below full HD. Avatar behaves pretty much the same way, with there obviously being a GPU bottleneck at 1080p, even with an RTX 4090 installed, whereas 720p shows the 9800X3D has a lot more room left in its tank. However, it isn't all that much ahead of the 7800X3D, and Intel, well, I don't think I even need to mention all that much here because their CPUs are just so far behind. Moving on to Baldur's Gate, and it's an interesting set of results, but for different reasons, since at both resolutions and detail settings, the 9800X3D is simply on another planet. I mean, I used to think the 7800X3D was fast, but this is something completely different. I also have to mention the 5800X3D. Despite it being more than 2 years old, actually almost 3 years old now, it holds up really well, especially at 1080p. In CS2, I get the distinct impression that we've reached the game engine's ability to deliver higher frame rates. But even with there being a bit of a ceiling here, the new X3D does get marginally better performance than its predecessor and a boost of 100 or more frames per second over the next fastest 9000 series CPU. The same can be said in Cyberpunk, but this time we're once again back to 10% better performance at 720p and about 7% at 1080p Ultra. So if you have one, this isn't going to make you want to ditch your 7800X3D. Actually, none of these results will. I also need to call out turbo mode here. Cyberpunk is a heavily multi-threaded game, so it's a bit surprising to see higher frame rates when disabling SMT, since the 9800X3D is running with just 8 threads here, but there it is. On the other hand, Doom sees no real advantage for turbo game mode, but the 9800X3D does see substantially better 1% lows than any other CPU here. The only exception to that is the 14900K, which finally gets a win at 720p. Then all the scores even out at 1080p, with the new X3D CPU winning in the 1% lows again. And that sort of yin and yang story between running with a GPU bottleneck and without one continues in Forza. I mean, look, the 9800X3D is the fastest gaming CPU on the planet, and it's ready for years of potential GPU upgrades. But if you only care about how it performs right now in the present time, in today's games, well, a lot of titles are going to end up looking like the one here at 1080p. Then again, it'll be very interesting to see how this all looks after next-gen GPUs launch next year. Meanwhile, Hogwarts is one of the games that sees big speedups for the 9800X3D over the 7800X3D at both resolutions. It's another title that might also make the 5800X3D owners out there think twice about keeping their processors. Okay, maybe not due to the pricing situation with the 9800X3D motherboards and memory these days, but it's still amazing to see how far these processors have come in under 3 years, isn't it? And Horizon Forbidden West, it brings us right back to a pretty cookie cutter situation for the 9800X3D. It's a bit less than 10% faster than the 7800X3D in a best case scenario, while delivering substantially better 1% lows. It's also way ahead of the Ryzen 9900 series CPUs, which sometimes have issues in games that haven't been optimized for their dual CCD layout. And before we'd started testing the 9800X3D, I thought we might have reached a GPU limitation at 1080p in Flight Simulator, but I guess I was wrong. Even at 720p, the new CPU smashes through the high watermarks attained by the 5800X3D and 7800X3D, while also offering almost 100 frames per second more than the 9700X. Its 3D V-cache is also hugely beneficial in online shooters like Rainbow Six, especially for people who play at lower detail or resolution settings to get a small advantage. It offers much higher frame rates than anything else at 720p, and even at 1080p, where the GPU limitation steps in just a little bit to limit performance, the 1% lows are still significantly better than anything else available right now. Unfortunately for AMD, there are a couple of titles that just don't play nice with X3D CPUs, and Rocket League is one of those. Here, the Ryzen 9000 series are all well ahead at 720p low and statistically tied at 1080p 1080p high. But let's put this into context for a second. We're talking about 1,000 frames per second or more. So any of these processors will get you more performance than you need in this game. But still, you've got to take this as a warning. 3D V-Cache isn't infallible. There's going to be titles out there that just don't support it well. And Spider-Man highlights another issue. The 9800X3D does really well at 720p, and it might look like it does well at 1080p too, but check out those 1% lows. The game had noticeable stutters, and it's an issue that AMD is aware of, and they're working on a fix. But we did find a workaround. Turning off SMT via the turbo game mode improved frame rate delivery and showed what this processor is actually capable of. Starfield, well, it doesn't really tell us anything that we didn't already know, but it does provide an interesting spin for the turbo mode results. This is one of the few games that actually saw a performance regression when using it, dropping the 9800X3D's performance below the 7800X3D. So while I haven't really mentioned it all that much, I'd use the turbo mode setting with a dose of caution. Test performance in games you play with it both on and off to see which option is absolutely the best. The same thing happens in Warhammer 3, but only at 720p, since the 1080p results are completely GPU bound. Another thing we're seeing here is the 9800X3D's average frame rates are only the tip of the iceberg. Its 1% lows are where we're seeing the most improvement, and in many ways, that metric is so much more important than the averages. Well, I guess that's it. It's mission accomplished for AMD. The 9800X3D is faster than the 7800X3D, especially when it's able to stretch its legs at lower detail settings and resolutions. But I also want to bring the discussion back to power consumption. Do all of AMD's changes allow the new X3D to consume less power and project less heat than the 7800X3D? Well, from a power consumption perspective when gaming, we're looking at comparable metrics to the 7800X3D, though the new CPU does tend to take a little bit more juice after all the numbers were averaged over 15 games. The bigger story, well, that's the 9800X3D versus 9700X. Even though it has a significantly higher maximum power envelope, it's overall way more efficient in gaming. I mean, it can deliver up to 40% higher frame rates while needing less power. And you can make the 9800X3D even less power hungry by enabling the turbo mode, and that generally leads to higher frame rates too. Even in a worst case scenario like Cyberpunk, the only CPU that needs less juice is the 7800X3D. Meanwhile, turbo mode needs fractionally less power overall and quite a bit less in Cyberpunk. But I'll say this again, while we only tested the new X3D chip with it enabled, turbo can be used on any 7000 or 9000 series CPU. And despite those slightly higher power consumption numbers than the 7800X3D, it looks like putting 3D V-Cache under the processing dies pays huge dividends in the temperature department. Even with a good air cooler, we never saw CPU temperatures above 60 degrees, which is lower than any current generation Ryzen CPU, including the 9700X. And I think temperatures like this might actually be something that flies under the radar. The 9700X and 9800X3D are essentially the same chip, and in gaming at least, they both hit the same average CPU core frequencies too. And yet the 9800X3D consumes less power and tends to run a lot cooler too, especially with turbo mode on. Of course, that points towards the benefits of moving that V-Cache under the CPU, but it also seems like AMD's heavily binning these chips, specifically for X3D use. Another thing I mentioned before is AMD's push to make these new X3D chips a lot more versatile than their predecessors. To do that, what they did is they bumped clock speeds significantly versus the 7800 X3D. And that is really good news for anybody who wants to use these processors in gaming, but also not sacrifice massive amounts of performance when using them in 2D workloads. But did that do anything negative to power consumption and temperatures? Well, the 9800 X3D consumes a lot more power than the 9700X and 7800 X3D. But that was expected given AMD's TDP for this CPU is a lot higher. That's simply because the 9700X's out-of-box TDP is just 65 watts, whereas the X3D chips get limited to 120 watts. Meanwhile, nothing, and I mean nothing, can touch the Intel chips here. Oh, and I have to mention, since turbo mode essentially disables SMT, we're now running with 8 cores and 8 threads instead of an 816 layout, so power, it naturally gets cut too. As for temperatures, when paired up with a 360mm AIO, the 9800 X3D ran marginally hotter than the 7800 X3D, which is good news when you consider it also offers much higher frequencies. But that doesn't mean it's that easy to cool under an all-core workload. As a matter of fact, it's just as hot as the 9950X, but that shouldn't come as any surprise, since this is essentially a single CCD sucking back 130 plus watts. That puts a lot of heat into one small condensed area. So obviously AMD needed to make some power consumption and heat sacrifices in order to make this chip sort of run really well in all-core workloads. But does that lead to the 9800X3D becoming this all-core 2D workload powerhouse? Well, in Cinebench R23, we definitely see AMD kept their promises. The 9800X3D cleanly beats the 9700X and is also miles ahead of the 7800X3D. In the more intensive 2024 version, it's pretty much the same story, but you can also see the effect these so-called turbo modes have on the chip. By disabling SMT, you're cutting the number of processing threads by half. Ironically though, even with that config, the 7800X3D beats it by only 10%. In single-threaded benchmarks, this new X3D clearly has an advantage over the previous generation chip. But like its on-paper specs alluded to, it's beaten by the 9700X due to that CPU's higher maximum boost frequency. This also points towards how critical the X3D's V-cache is. It largely runs at about the same frequency as the 9700X in games, but it can provide much higher frame rates. Other real-world applications that are heavily multi-threaded show the 9800 X3D neatly threading the performance gap between the 9700X and 9900X, while offering substantially better performance than any previous X3D CPU. In a lot of ways, this is the first X3D processor versatile enough to provide really good productivity horsepower while simply dominating every other CPU in gaming. However, that additional capability does come with a slight price increase versus the 7800 X3D. Well, at least on paper, since that CPU is going for more than its MSRP currently, if you can even find one. It's also right in line with other Ryzen 9000 series chips in video render output performance, so creators aren't losing anything if they want a CPU for both gaming and editing. A lot of people were asking for a processor that does literally everything, and this is exactly what AMD is launching here. Alright, so let's sum this up. First of all, I'll put it right here on the table. This is the first CPU that I am genuinely excited about that is launched in 2024, because what AMD is offering here is pretty unique. They're offering the best of both worlds. On one hand, you have the 1080p results that you saw, which show what this CPU can do right now in current games with high settings at a realistic resolution. On the other hand, the 720p results are probably for me the more interesting ones. That is because they show what the 9800X3D can offer in the future. Because even though we're running with an RTX 4090, there's evidently a substantial amount of GPU bottlenecking going on at 1080p. So the 9800X3D's performance gets capped. Meanwhile, at 720p, it was able to stretch its legs a lot more, even when averaged over 15 games. So if you focus only on those 1080p high settings, it doesn't really offer all that much performance improvement over the 7800X3D. As a matter of fact, if you're running anything less than an RTX 4090, you'll likely be GPU limited in many games at 1080p, where a 9700X can get frame rates that are within just 10% of this new X3D chip. But you have to remember, guys, we're at the very end of this GPU generation, and I have a feeling the 9800X3D still has a lot left in the tank. And this whole situation, it sort of brings me back in time to when the 5800X3D launched. Right now, we all think of it as the GOAT, the best gaming-focused CPU that has ever been launched. But that's mostly because people expect the CPU and its platform to live through multiple generations of GPU updates. The 5800X3D though, when it launched, we could never predict how good it was actually going to be. But you have to remember, it was reviewed on RTX 3000 series cards when it first launched, and it only showed its true potential when the RTX 4000 series came out. And the 5800X3D is still proving it'll last through plenty of future GPU upgrades too. So the 9800X3D might not show huge improvements right now at 1080p with high details, but the 720p results, well, those show something completely different. And that something completely different is that it can stand up to future GPU upgrades better than any CPU that's come before it. As for Intel, well, that's a subject I sort of need to broach here too. This is the first time that we see an X3D chip launching where there is no competition from Intel, despite the fact that they just launched Arrow Lake. And I think they need to make a decision here. Are they interested in competing in the gaming CPU market, or not. Because AMD has now launched a processor that absolutely destroys the 285K in gaming while being more efficient and costing a whole lot less. They need an answer, and Arrow Lake obviously isn't it. So basically, if you want a CPU that'll help you avoid bottlenecks right now while offering that exact same thing through future GPU upgrades that you might have planned, and all while offering very good 2D performance, well, the 9800X3D, in my opinion, is worth every penny. And with that, I'm gonna sort of sign off here and hope I get over this cold of mine that's been nagging for a couple of weeks. I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks, and I'm gonna see you guys in the next one. Have a great day.